Thank you, Brian. It is really a joy to be back with the Orlando Church, and thank you for receiving me so well last week, and for all the encouraging things that you've said this week. And for so many of you joining tonight, I really am looking forward to our time together as we study God's Word. And I look forward to doing the best I can and answering some of your questions. As Brian said, from last week, there were questions about 1 Corinthians 11 and 14. So we are closer to the heart of the matter as far as the question of Bible and gender in the church is concerned. And so without any further ado, I'm going to jump right in it. Brian, just confirm for me, please, that what is being displayed is my title slide.
Yep, you're there on number 2. Yep.
Thank you. Thank you. All right, great. So tonight we continue with our second class, which will be on 1 Corinthians 11 and 1 Corinthians 14. As I said last week, the series is 3 parts. Last week, we began with the wide angle shot by looking at Genesis 1 to 3 and how it relates to gender at creation and fall. And then we closed out by looking at God's plan for restoration in Christ. Tonight, we're going to zoom in and examine the passages in 1 Corinthians 11 and 14, which deal with gender roles in the worship assembly. And then next week, Lord willing, for our third and final class, we'll examine the passages in 1 Timothy 2 and Titus 2. So if you think tonight is hot, next week is going to get even hotter. And those passages speak about gender roles in the church, not just the worship assembly, but in the church overall. As Brian said, as we did last week, we want to have question and answers at the end, so you could put those questions in the chat. And when we get to the end, we'll do our best to see how we can answer them. But before we start our study of 1 Corinthians 11 and 14, I want to set the stage by saying that these are 2 difficult New Testament passages. I think we can acknowledge the fact that much of the Bible is straightforward and easy to understand. But we also have to acknowledge and recognize that not all of it is straightforward and easy to understand. There are, in fact, some parts of the Bible that are difficult to understand. And so even the Apostle Peter says that some of what Paul wrote was difficult to understand. Peter writes in 2 Peter 3, verses 15 and 16, bear in mind that our Lord's patience means salvation, just as our dear brother Paul also wrote you with the wisdom that God gave him. He, Paul, writes the same way in all his letters, speaking in them of these matters. His letters contain some things that are hard to understand, which ignorant and unstable people distort as they do the other scriptures to their own destruction. So Peter says right here that Paul's letters contain some things, not all things, but some things that are hard to understand. And it's clear from what he's saying that it takes knowledge and spiritual maturity to handle passages like that properly. And I think that would include passages like 1 Corinthians 11 and 14. And so we have to be humble and study carefully and recognize that it is hard to properly understand and apply some passages that are difficult. But we're even more challenged than Peter and his contemporaries because time, space, culture, and language separate us from the original writings of the New Testament. So it was difficult for Peter and his contemporaries to understand some of what Paul said. It's even more difficult for us because we have a distance in time, in culture, and in language. I think to illustrate this, of an interaction I had a few years ago on the occasion of visiting with the church in Columbia, South Carolina, where I had the opportunity to do some teaching. And as I got to the airport, one of the brothers on the staff of the church and his wife picked me up. And as we were in the car driving from the airport to their home, the brother asked me if that was my first time in Columbia, South Carolina. And I responded, no, I've been here before. I actually was here in 2012, along with some good friends of mine, Peter and Sandy Swaby, and we were here to look for Damien Jean-Baptiste. And so the brother said to me, he's driving, he almost turned around, he says, well, why were you looking for him? And then I said, well, because he was ill. And then the brother says, no, but why were you looking for him? Was he lost? And then the lights went on in my head. Oh, looking for him is not something people say all around the world. You see, in Jamaica, we talk about going to look for someone to mean we're going to visit them. And so I had to step back and say, what I mean to say is I was here to visit Damien because he was ill. Now, I think that illustrates a difficulty in understanding that is posed by language, culture, and geography. I don't think Jamaica is an alien culture to the United States, but it's a different culture. And even though we were speaking the very same language, there was this difficulty in understanding each other because of how that language was used. These difficulties are amplified when it comes to us reading the Bible. It's written thousands of years ago in a different language, an ancient language or languages, and in a culture that is far removed from our own, and a geography that I think we could say is on the other side of the world. And so we need to be humble and not dogmatic as we wrestle with passages that are difficult to understand in the scriptures, even as we strive to be careful in our reading of them. Now, we tend to think that the Bible is flat. And by flat, I mean, we tend to think that it's all equally easy to understand, that everything is black and white and there's no gray, and all the passages are equally important. But this isn't true. Some passages are more difficult to understand than others. And because of these difficulties of understanding with some passages, it isn't absolutely clear what the correct meaning is. And so there's some room for disagreement. Christian scholars with good hearts, in fact, have different views on what some of these difficult passages mean. I think it can help us if we think of the Bible as having different circles of importance in terms of its teaching and doctrines that are to be believed. So what you have here on the screen is an image that would suggest that when it comes to the Bible, there are certain parts of it that are core, certain parts of it that are important, and certain parts of it that are peripheral. Let me explain what I mean. The core teachings or doctrines in the Bible or passages, these are critical. Getting these right goes to the heart of whether we're a Christian or not. That would include things like Jesus being the Son of God, that Jesus died for our sins, that Jesus came in the flesh, that God the Father, the Holy Spirit, and Jesus are all God. Passages that teach about salvation, we got to get that right. Sin, love, and how critical that is, the part of the Christian life. Those are core teachings. We have to be unified and agree on those. But then there are some other teachings that are important. These are important, but they're not matters of fellowship. For example, the requirements to appoint elders, or whether we can use instruments in worship in the church, or the subject that we're discussing tonight is very important, but it's not a matter of fellowship or not. And that is whether women can teach, for example, or speak in the church, or gender roles. Those are very important. But on some of the passages, because they're difficult, there is room for disagreement. And so we ought not to be dogmatic with each other. We ought rather to seek to have conversation and to try to understand the different viewpoints that we come at the subject from. And then finally, there are the peripheral matters, things like what happened to Ishmael, or how many sisters did Jesus have, or whether Paul was married before his conversion. These things are interesting, but they're not significant. If we can appreciate these differences, we can understand that there's room for disagreement even on important issues. And this helps us to be humble with each other and to be able to be open to the decisions of the leadership of the church on issues in respect of which there is room for disagreement. Now, the next thing that we need to appreciate as we approach 1 Corinthians 11 and 14 is that when we're reading those passages, we're reading part of a letter. And being a letter brings its own difficulties as far as interpreting and understanding these passages. You see, a letter represents only a part of a conversation or one half of a correspondence, and as such, one side is missing. And that requires us to acknowledge that in reading the one part that we have, we will be missing something in our interpretation and will not be able to understand all the details. It's been said that reading a New Testament letter is like listening to one side of a telephone conversation. And you can imagine how misunderstanding can result from that. And that's because we're left to fill in the blanks. You hear someone on the other side, he said, what? I can't believe. And you're trying to figure out what the other person is saying. And so you can, in fact, fill in a lot of the blanks by paying close attention to the one side of the conversation you have. And we can do this with the New Testament letters. Scholars call that mirror reading. In other words, you're reading the part that you have as a mirror that you're trying to discern what it is reflecting on the other side. But this is even more difficult to do because we're dealing with a letter, because we don't have tone or body language or facial expression to help us. And it has inherent limitations that we have to recognize. And so one of the things that we have to understand in reading the New Testament letters is we've got to be careful about building doctrine or dogmatic positions on letters, because a letter does not represent the writer's final thoughts on a subject, but is brief comments in a conversation addressing a specific situation. The letters are often called occasional documents. That means they're written to address an occasion. And so they're not intended to be universal in their application. There may be principles that are universal, but the specifics that are being said in the letter are not intended to address all people in all places at all times. The next thing that we need to recognize is because the letters are really a part of a conversation, we just don't know all that we would like to know. And some things we are not going to know. I was in the Bahamas this weekend and someone asked me as I was teaching the Bible, what does it mean when Paul is talking about baptism for the dead? And I honestly said, I don't know. We don't know. There are different thoughts about it. But Paul's audience would have understood, but we're outside the conversation and we are removed culturally and by time. And so we don't know specifically what he would have been addressing. But the thing that we can be confident of is that we do have what we need. 2 Timothy 3:16 says that the word of God thoroughly equips us for every good work. So the things that we can't know for sure, that's because we don't need to know those. But the things that we do know for sure are sufficient to help us to make it to heaven, which is God's plan in giving us the word of God. Well, a part of how we read a New Testament letter is by seeking to understand its historical context. And by that, I mean its background, who wrote it, to who, when, where, why, etc. Well, let's talk a little bit about what we know about the historical context of the letter that we call 1 Corinthians. Well, you see on the left there, that pin beside Corinth, it identifies the location of the city, really in a part of the world that we would call Greece. Back then it was called Achaia. So Corinth was an immoral cosmopolitan city, and that meant it had a lot of cultural influences because of how well it was situated for trade. It was a port city. You can see it's on a little isthmus, a little land bridge, and that made it an excellent location for ships to come in and they'd move cargo across that little land bridge to the other side for safe sailing. Well, Paul wrote the letter of 1 Corinthians from Ephesus. You'll see that other pin across the Aegean Sea. And he wrote the letter somewhere around 53 to 55 AD to the church that he had established in Corinth on his second missionary journey. And what had happened is that Paul was in Ephesus, and whilst there, he received oral reports of several problems in the church in Corinth that needed to be addressed. And he also received a letter from the church that asked a number of questions that the Corinthians wanted Paul to answer. So Paul in 1 Corinthians 3 describes the church in Corinth as worldly and not spiritual, because what had happened was the culture of Corinth, a boastful, immoral culture, had come into the church. And so beginning in chapter 11 and continuing to chapter 14, the specific problem that Paul deals with is disorder in the church's worship assembly. And the problems he addresses include how women dressed when they prophesied and prayed in the assembly, social divisions in taking the communion, which dishonor the body of Christ, the improper use of spiritual gifts like speaking in tongues and so on. Those are being used to exalt self instead of edifying the church. And there was a chaotic and disruptive talking over each other by prophets, tongue speakers, and women. And in the midst of all this, Paul urges love as the antidote to the worldly culture, which was poisoning the church, as evidenced by these problems in its corporate worship. So we get to the text. In 1 Corinthians 11, Paul begins dealing with the problems in the church's corporate worship by commending them for keeping the traditions, commending the Corinthians for keeping the traditions that he had given to them. Well, let's read that. Paul says in 1 Corinthians 11, verse 2, "No, I commend you because you remember me in everything and maintain the traditions even as I delivered them to you. But I want you to understand that the head of every man is Christ, and the head of a wife is her husband, and the head of Christ is God." So Paul here is commending them for keeping the traditions, but he's saying this because he's preparing to challenge them on the ways in which they're not following the traditions that he delivered to them. And so, for example, in 1 Corinthians 11, with regards to the communion, he says in the following instructions, "I do not commend you." Or, for example, in 1 Corinthians 11:16, he says, "We have no such practice, nor do the churches," referring to the fact that they were not following the practice of the churches as far as how they dealt with women and speaking, prophesying and praying in the church. So having set them up for the challenge that he's going to give them to the ways in which they're not keeping the traditions, he next says, "But I want you to understand that the head of every man is Christ, the head of a wife is her husband, and the head of Christ is God." There are a couple of things we need to understand up front. Firstly, the real issue that Paul is dealing with in 1 Corinthians 11, 2-16 is women prophesying and praying during the church's worship assembly without having their head covered. And so it is clear that the women could and did pray and prophesy during the church's worship meetings. The problem was that they were doing it without covering their heads, which was something new. And it seems that it was something that was culturally disruptive. We're going to come to that shortly. But I mention it here because Paul's statements here about headship are not his main point, though we tend to focus on this a lot. This is incidental to Paul's main point and the issue he's addressing. And it's here to provide support for his argument that women in the church should cover their heads whilst prophesying and praying. The second thing I want us to understand before we talk about what Paul means by these headship arguments is that it's important for us to understand that throughout the passage, wherever we see the word woman or wife, it is the same Greek word, gune. And that word means both woman and wife in the Greek. And so the translators to English have to make an interpretive choice based on the context as to whether Paul means woman or wife each time gune is used. This is, of course, important to some of us who are single women, and we're going to wonder about the applicability of some of Paul's statements to us. Are they confined to the marriage relationship, or do they apply to women generally? Similarly, the Greek word aner, which means both man and husband, is used throughout the passage, and translators have to make choices as to whether Paul means husband or man based on the context. Now, before we talk about what Paul means, I want you to notice, and I put up here the NIV of that same verse we just read in the ESV, and you'll notice that the NIV translates aner and gune in 1 Corinthians 11:3 as man and woman, unlike the ESV, which translates the second incident of aner as husband, and on the instance of gune as wife. I think the NIV translation can be justified given the context with the passage's allusions to creation and relationship with God, which is wider than marriage. But the point I'm making is these decisions have got to be made. But let's talk about what Paul means. Paul says the head of every man is Christ, the head of the woman is man, and the head of Christ is God. Since the problem that Paul is addressing is related to women not covering their heads, and this apparently had something to do with how they're related to men, as well as proper conduct in worshiping God, Paul uses the word head to describe the correct relationship between men and women and with God. It's clear that he's using the word head to describe an ordering of these relationships. As you can see from the graphic I have here, essentially he says that God is the head of Christ because he's his father. Christ is the head of man, and man is the head of woman. And you see, we could translate husband is the head of wife, depending on what translation choice we make. What is obvious is that Paul is saying here that what he's saying here is not something that was confined to the culture of his time, but it is universal. And the reason I say that is because it's based in the nature of man's relationship with God. And so if he's talking about man's relationship with God, then he's not talking about something that is culturally confined. And as we will see later, he's also talking about the order of creation. And again, that is not something that is culturally confined, that is something that is universal. The question that we've got to answer next is, what does Paul mean by the use of the word head right here? The Greek word translated head throughout the passage is kephale. And like the English word head, kephale can have different connotations. It can refer to or mean authority. It could refer to prominence or preeminence. It could refer to source or origin. And there's a debate in scholarship as to how this word should be translated in this passage. The minority view is that the word can be translated source, meaning that the man is the source of the woman, and thereby it would not connote him having any authority over her. However, the majority view that is supported by the major New Testament Greek lexicons, or we could call them dictionaries, is that the meaning of the word kephale as used in 1 Corinthians 11 and Ephesians 5 is head. And that describes a hierarchy with authority. And so it involves a subordination between the male and the female. This is the view that I share. I agree with the majority position. For one thing, and this is one of the reasons why I agree with the majority position, source does not work in context throughout the passage. For instance, it's questionable whether we could say that God is the source of Christ, okay? But clearly we can say that God is the head of Christ because there is subordination within the Godhead, within the Trinity. Secondly, reading kephale as head indicating authority is consistent with Paul's use of the term in other passages, for example, Ephesians 5. And there Paul says, wives, submit yourselves to your own husbands as you do to the Lord. For the husband is the head of the wife, kephale, as Christ is the head of the church, kephale, his body, of which he is the savior. Now, as the church submits to Christ, so also wives submit to their husbands in everything. Now, it's clear from this passage that head or kephale is being used here by Paul to connote authority and as required submission. And source doesn't work here, as husbands are not the source of their wives, and the reference to submission means authority is clearly in view. Now, the reason why some interpreters do not like the translation of kephale as head and is connoting authority and prefer source as a translation for that word is because they think that this translation, head, diminishes women, whom they correctly point out are made in the image of God and therefore are equal to men. But this objection is based on two misconceptions that we need to clear up. Firstly, understanding God's ordering of human relationships as a hierarchy in which the man or husband is at the head and the woman or wife are subordinated does not mean that women are inferior to men, which is how, that's a misconception. People tend to think that if you say that a woman is subordinate to a man, that means that she is less than him. And so to correct this misunderstanding, we need to understand that equality does not equate to sameness. And we also need to understand that a role is not the same as someone's value. The fact that men and women are equal does not mean that they are the same. God made them different. You've noticed this. And he's assigned them different roles. He assigned men the role of headship, which requires women to play a subordinate role. But the fact that women are subordinate to men as the head doesn't mean that women are less than men in value or that women are not equal to men. So to put it bluntly, men and women are equal but not the same, and they have been given different roles. And so, as is, I think, beautifully expressed in the ICOC teacher service team exposition on the topic Bible and gender, since in the Godhead, the Father, who's the head, is equal to the Son and the Spirit with different roles, then it follows males and females can be equal with different roles. Just as the Godhead has different purposes, so male and females have different purposes. So Christ submits to God, the Father in the Godhead, but Christ is fully God. He's not less God because he submits to his Father. This is how relationships are ordered in the Godhead, and there is complete unity. Well, we're made in the image of God, male and female, and we are to imitate this unity by playing our assigned roles in love and humility as in the Godhead. Now, I think we have difficulty in understanding this because we confuse roles with value. Let me illustrate this. Between 2019 and 2021, I served as a managing partner at the law firm where I practice here in Kingston. And during that time, my other partners would submit to my leadership. I would call meetings, I would lead the meetings, I would make decisions, and generally they would submit to the decisions that I made in that role. But at December 31, 2021, I ceased being the managing partner of the firm. And so I started going to meetings and having to submit to the new managing partner. Now, was I any less equal to my partners after I stopped being the managing partner? Or let's put it another way. Did I somehow become greater than them during the time that I was the managing partner? No. As a matter of law, we all were equal in terms of our status as partners in the firm, indeed as persons. And yet, because I had a role, part of how the firm functioned was that they would submit to the role that I had been given, and I would lead the firm. Now, my value doesn't change based on my role. I've had different roles in life. At one point, I served as an evangelist here in Kingston. I currently serve as a teacher for the Kingston Church of Christ. But if I were to go to another congregation, I wouldn't be a teacher in that congregation. But regardless of what role I am in, my value does not change based on my role. My value is inherent. It is based in my intrinsic worth in being made in the image of God. In the same way, women have equal intrinsic worth as men based on their inherent value as being made in the image of God. And at the resurrection, these roles that male and female have been given are going to disappear because we're going to be like the angels. Read Matthew 22:30 and Mark 12:25. But until then, God has ordered our relationships and assigned us roles, and we are to play them understanding that they do not make us any more or less valuable in his sight or in fact. Now, the second misconception that we need to clear up that leads some interpreters to think that translated kephale as head diminishes women is that male headship is about men ruling over women. This misconception is based on what our common experience of how men have related to women in the fallen world around us looks like. But this is in fact male fallenness, as God described in Genesis 3, we did that last week, when God told Eve that her husband would rule over her or dominate her. That was not prescriptive, it was descriptive of the fall. It's not what God intended, nor what Paul means by male headship. What Paul means by male headship is servant leadership like Christ, who told his disciples they were not to be like Gentiles who exercise authority over others, but to be like him who served others. And Paul describes this kind of servant leadership in Ephesians 5. Husbands, love your wives, just as Christ loved the church and gave himself up for her to make her holy, cleansing her by the washing of water through the word, and to present her to himself as a radiant church without stain or wrinkle or any other blemish, but holy and blameless. In this same way, husbands ought to love their wives as their own bodies. He who loves his wife loves himself. So being head is not about ruling over my wife. It's about my coming under her in servitude. Being head doesn't mean that my role is to get my wife to submit. My wife's submission is to Christ. That's between her and him. That's not my business. That's their business. Being head is about my being like Christ. It's about my loving like he loved me in the church. It's about meeting my wife's needs, doing what is in her best interest and not mine. In fact, it means loving her as I love my very self, because we're one body, or as it's put in Genesis 2, one flesh and bone, like God created man and woman in Genesis 2. I won't bother to read Mark 10, 42 to 45. You know this passage. I'll read it. Jesus called his disciples together and said, you know that those who are regarded as rulers of the Gentiles lord it over them, and their high officials exercise authority over them. Not so with you. Instead, whoever wants to become great among you must be your servant, and whoever wants to be first must be slave of all. For even the Son of Man did not come to be served, but to serve and to give his life as a ransom for many. You see, this kind of servant leadership is not confined only to within marriage, but is the standard and the example that Jesus set for leadership throughout the entire church. Well, having discussed what Paul means by headship in 1 Corinthians 11:3, we can continue reading what he writes in this section of the letter. He says, every man who prays or prophesies with his head covered dishonors his head, but every wife who prays or prophesies with her head uncovered dishonors her head. This is the same as if her head were shaven. Well, having made the point that Christ is the head of man and man is the head of woman, Paul now uses this metaphor as the basis of his argument in verses 4 to 5 that women should cover their heads whilst they're prophesying or praying in the church's worship service. Whilst the women are the focus of the argument, he begins by arguing that the opposite position applies to the men. He says that every man who prays or prophesies with his head covered dishonors his head. Now, in the context of the previous verse, dishonoring his head would mean, most likely, dishonoring Christ. And so Paul is saying that for men to cover their head whilst praying or prophesying would dishonor Christ. And the reason behind this statement would have been clear to Paul's audience, but like I say, we're removed by time and culture and geography, and so it's not as clear to us. Some scholars suggest that since the words with his head covered in the Greek is literally having down from the head, it is referring to something that is pulled down on the head like a scarf. And they postulate that it refers to the practice of Roman men pulling down the toga for worship to prevent distractions. Now, because this was associated with pagan worship, a male Christian would dishonor his head when he covered his physical head with a toga, because by imitating the pagan practice, he shamed Christ and himself. In any event, we're not so sure exactly what it means, but it seems to be something cultural, why Paul considered it to be dishonoring to Christ for men to pray or prophesy with their head covered. By contrast to the men, Paul says every wife who prays or prophesies with her head uncovered dishonors her head. And he most likely is referring there to dishonoring her husband based on the previous verse. Now, again, something cultural is behind Paul's reasoning here. It would have been clear to Paul's audience what he meant, but again, isn't as clear to us. However, most scholars think Paul is referring to the fact that married women in the Greco-Roman world would have worn a head covering or veil or a shawl as a symbol of their husband's authority over them. As head coverings were symbols of hierarchy and submission, a married woman who uncovered her head in public would have brought shame to her husband. And the action may have suggested sexual availability, or may simply have been a sign of being unmarried or not under the authority of her husband. So what you're looking at here are some photos of Roman statues of dressed women that were taken by me in about October 2021 at the Antalya Museum in Turkey. Now, during Paul's time, that part of the world, Turkey, would have been referred to as a province of Asia. And that's a province in which Ephesus was located. And remember, I told you, Ephesus is the city where Paul was writing to Corinth from. Now, whilst Ephesus is a different locale than Corinth, remember it's across Aegean Sea, it would have had similar dress customs and codes because both locales were a part of the Greco-Roman world. Now, these images depict how women would have dressed in the Roman world. I want you to notice that the woman on the left of your screen has her head uncovered. And this would depict her as an unmarried woman. An unmarried woman was not required to cover her head. Only married women in the Greco-Roman society were required to cover their heads in public. Now, the woman on the right has her head covered. And this would depict her as a married woman or a matron. In fact, I've got lots of pictures of statues depicting women wearing head covering, and this would have been to depict married women having the virtues of modesty and submission. In fact, Bruce Winter in his book, Roman Wives, Roman Widows, indicates that as a head covering symbolizes the husband's authority over his wife, the omission of the veil by a married woman was a sign of her withdrawing herself from the marriage. Now, this is kind of like akin to the message that would be conveyed in our culture by a married person taking off the wedding ring before they left the house. I'll keep mine on, thank you very much. Now, this is a cultural context that is behind what Paul says in 1 Corinthians 11, 5-6, where he says, every wife who prays or prophesies with her head uncovered dishonors her head, since it is the same as if her head were shaven. For if a wife will not cover her head, then she should cut her hair short. But since it is disgraceful for a wife to cut off her hair or shave her head, let her cover her head. Notice that word disgraceful. When we get to 1 Corinthians 14, I'm going to tell you something about it, but stick a pin there for the time being. I want you to notice that Paul doesn't have a problem with women praying and prophesying in the church. What he's a problem with is they're doing so with their heads uncovered, because in his view, this dishonors their husbands. As long as a wife's head was covered while she was speaking, it was perfectly fine for her to pray and prophesy in the church's corporate worship. In fact, they had been doing this before. The problem only arose when some women started doing this without their heads being covered. Paul says, praying and prophesying without your head covered dishonors your husband. And then he makes an argument that praying or prophesying with their heads uncovered is the same as if a woman's head was shaven. A woman's head was shaven in the ancient world to shame them for behavior such as adultery. And a shaved head denoted an adulteress within the community. And so Paul is therefore equating the women praying or prophesying with their heads uncovered, with the disgrace of a shaved head. And he goes on to say, if a woman will not cover her head, she might as well shave her head. But if she's not willing to shave her head because it's a disgrace, then she should cover her head. Well, we can't completely follow Paul's argument because we lack some of the cultural understanding shared by him and his audience. But it does seem that his point is that if uncovering the head by shaving is a disgrace, such that a woman wouldn't want to do that, then she should not uncover her head whilst praying or prophesying in the church, because this is also a form of disgrace. In verse 7, Paul says, for a man ought not to cover his head, since he's the image and glory of God, but woman is the glory of man. For man is not made from woman, but woman from man. Neither was man created for woman, but woman for man. Now notice the for. Whenever you're reading the Bible, and particularly a letter in the New Testament, which really, they contain a lot of arguments, you got to take note of those connecting words. And this for right here means that what Paul is saying in this verse right here is a reason for something that he said earlier. He's giving the reason for it. And I think the for right here in verse 7 relates to the instruction that Paul gave in verse 4, where he says that every man who prays or prophesied with his head covered dishonors his head, but every wife who prays or prophesies with her head uncovered dishonors her head. In other words, what he says in these verses 7 to 9 provide the reason for what he directs in verse 4. And so if in verse 6 he told us why women should not uncover their heads, in verse 7 he's telling us why men should not cover their heads. And he says that a man should not cover his head because he's the image and glory of God. By contrast, he says, woman is the glory of man. Now, again, I told you this is a difficult passage. Paul's argument is very difficult to follow here. However, notice that he's careful not to say that woman is the image of man. And the reason why I think he's careful not to say that is because he knows his Bible. And we know from Genesis 1:26 to 27, which we read last week, that both men and women are the image of God. But Paul seems to have the creation account in Genesis 2 in mind, not Genesis 1. And he's focused on the fact that God made man first. And so in the order of things, man is the glory of God. That means man shows the excellence of God because God made man. And woman, who was created second and was made from man, is the glory of man because she shows man's excellence in that she was taken out of man. Paul's point seems to be that given the creation order, man reflects God's glory, and so should not cover his head in worship, as this would dishonor Christ and God. But woman, coming from man and being created for him, remember, Adam was alone and it was not good, and therefore being his glory because she came from him, she should cover her head and not dishonor him. Now, nothing Paul says here is intended to suggest that woman is inferior to man. Woman was created for man, not because she's subservient to him, but simply because he was created first. And he was by that means the one who was in need. In God's created order, God created woman to complete man. But God in his sovereignty has by this ordering chosen to give headship to men. Now I think about my daughter, Chelsea, who is 5 years older than my son, Chase. And when they were children, I remember doing a family devotional with them, where we taught the children that God was the one who chose Chelsea to be born first. And that meant she was Chase's big sister. And that meant she had certain roles. She was to look out for her brother. She was to set an example for him. She was to take care of him. She was to love him. And then we taught my son Chase that he needed to listen to his sister, and he needed to not be proud with her. And that worked quite well, I must tell you. And to this day, the relationship that the two of them have, there's a dynamic where he understands and she understands that just based on their birth order, there's certain roles and there's a way in which they relate to each other. I think order is determined by God, and it affects roles. I think this is Paul's point here. Now, in 1 Corinthians 11, verses 10, Paul continues, he says, that is why a wife ought to have a symbol of authority on her head, because of the angels. Nevertheless, in the Lord, woman is not independent of man, nor man. Let me read that again. Nevertheless, in the Lord, woman is not independent of man, nor man of woman. For as woman is made from man, so man is now born of woman, and all things are from God. So Paul says, because of this divinely determined order, whereby man is created first and woman is therefore created from man and for man, a wife should have a symbol of authority on her head. And most likely he's referring to the head covering, which signified in that culture that she was under her husband's authority. Well, you may be asking, what does he mean by because of the angels? Well, your good is as good as mine, if not as good as the scholars who've written lots of books about it. I think whilst Paul's audience would most likely have understood exactly what he meant because they shared a similar context, the precise meaning is unclear to us because of the difference in, yes, time and culture. But we do have what we need, and the essential idea is there. If you want guesses as to what it could mean, there are a number of options. One, the angels maybe are present when the church worship, and the angels modeled worship for God by covering themselves with their wings. Some people suggest it could mean that the angels who were tempted by the beauty of women, like the sons of God who became sexually involved with beautiful women in Genesis 6. Some suggest it could be the messengers, because the word angel in the Greek, angelos, really does mean messenger. And so it could be referring to persons who are spying on the Christians during their house church meetings to go back and tell others who enforce the Roman dress code laws. Well, we don't know for sure, but I don't think that is important for us to know, for us to get the sense of the passage. Importantly, and we tend to miss this, in verse 11, Paul says, nevertheless. And he is, by what he says in the next two verses, qualifying all that he's been saying about the creation order of men, women, and how it affects the question of women covering their heads as a symbol of authority. And what he's saying is, notwithstanding the fact that woman was made from man and for man, in the Lord, woman is not independent of man, nor man of woman. For as woman was made from man, so man is now born of woman, and all things are from God, meaning both men and women are created by God. Notice, Paul is emphasizing the interdependence, the mutuality, and the equality of men and women, and he's emphasizing the need for unity between men and women. Well, then in verses 13 to 16, Paul comes back to his essential point, that is that it's improper for a woman to pray to God with her head uncovered. He says, judge for yourselves. Is it proper for a wife to pray to God with her head uncovered? Does not nature itself teach you that if a man wears long hair, it's a disgrace for him? But if a woman has long hair, it's her glory. For her hair is given to her for a covering. If anyone is inclined to be contentious, we have no such practice, nor do the churches of God. Here, Paul is supporting his argument by now appealing to nature. And he seems to be saying that since women generally have more hair than men, and it was disgraceful in his culture for a man to wear long hair, whilst long hair was a woman's glory, a lot of that stuff has changed culturally. Nature therefore supported a woman's head covering because hair is given to women as a covering. In other words, women naturally have more covering on their head, and so that suggests their heads are to be covered. And Paul closes his argument by seeking to put an end to any further argument by saying, well, if you, after all I've said, you still want to argue, then understand that I don't, nor any of my churches, nor any of the churches have any other practice than for women to pray with their head covered. And what he's doing here, he's calling on the selfishly ambitious and proud Corinthians to be humble and to be unified with others outside of their congregation in how they approach this issue. So whilst Paul was addressing a disruptive practice in the church in Corinth, whereby women were praying and prophesying with their heads uncovered, it is clear that women were participating in the worship service in Corinth by praying and prophesying. And from Paul's reference to his practice and the practice of the churches of God, this appears to have been a widespread practice in the early church. Recall that the evangelist Philip in Acts had 4 unmarried daughters who all prophesied. So women did speak in the church. They prophesied and they prayed. The issue that's being dealt with here is the issue of whether they do so with their heads uncovered or not. Okay, so let's turn and quickly consider 1 Corinthians 14, 33 to 35, which has been used in the past in the tradition out of which we have come as a church to say that women should be silent in the worship assembly. But to get the context, let's read from verse 26. As we said previously, 1 Corinthians 11:14 deals with problems in how the church's corporate worship was being conducted. Now, after chapter 11, chapter 12, Paul addresses the showy misuse of spiritual gifts, reminding the Corinthians that they are one body in Christ. And then in chapter 13, he points them towards love as an antidote to all their selfish, ambitious behavior, because that behavior was causing disorder in their worship. Then we get to chapter 14. He deals specifically with the confusion in the worship service and the practice of tongue speaking and prophecy. And in verse 26, he says, "What then, brothers? When you come together, each of you has a hymn, a lesson, a revelation, a tongue, or an interpretation. Let all things be done for building up. If any speak in a tongue, let there be only two, or at the most three, and each in turn, and let someone interpret. But if there's no one to interpret, let each of them keep silent in church and speak to himself and to God." Now notice Paul tells the tongue speakers to be silent if there's no interpreter. Notice again that this is not an absolute prohibition of speech. He's not saying be silent and don't talk at all, but it's a prohibition of disruptive speech during worship. Well, then we get to 1 Corinthians 14:29. And Paul says, "Let two or three prophets speak and let the others weigh what is said. If a revelation is made to another sitting there, let the first be silent, for you can all prophesy one by one, so that all may learn and all be encouraged. And the spirits of the prophets are subject to prophets. For God's not a God of confusion, but of peace." Now notice also that the prophets are to be silent when another one is speaking, because they can control themselves. And Paul says specifically that they can all prophesy, but one by one. Again, this is not an absolute prohibition against a prophet speaking in the worship assembly, but a prohibition of disruptive speech that would lead to confusion in the worship of the church. And then we get to 1 Corinthians 14:33 to 35, which is the passage that says women are to keep silent. And Paul says there, as in all the churches of the saints, the women should keep silent in the churches, for they're not permitted to speak, but should be in submission. As the law also says, if there's anything they desire to learn, let them ask their husbands at home, for it's shameful for a woman to speak in church. Notice that the mention of churches in verse 34 means that Paul's statement is not limited to one local church situation. Now, in context, as with the tongue speakers and the prophets, which we read on the previous two slides, this is not an absolute prohibition against women speaking during the worship of the church, but a prohibition against disruptive speech, which is the subject of 1 Corinthians 14. Really, 11 to 14 is about disorder in worship, and in 14, Paul is dealing with speech that is chaotic and disruptive. Now, we know this is not only the context, we know this not only from the context of the earlier verses dealing with prophets and tongue speakers, but from the earlier context of 1 Corinthians 11. Because in 1 Corinthians 11, we've seen that women were in fact praying and prophesying during church service, and the only issue that Paul had was that some of them were doing so without their heads covered. And so Paul is not saying don't talk at all. He's fine with them talking. The issue is their heads are to be covered. Now, it's not entirely clear what was disruptive about the women's speech, which led to Paul saying that this kind of disruptive speech needed to cease. There are some clues from the text. It seems that there was something insubmissive about the speech. It seems that they were asking questions during the worship service, which made Paul tell them to ask their husbands at home. But it isn't clear what Paul is referring to when he says that the law also says women should be in submission. Some people say it could be the Old Testament, it could be Roman law or Greco-Roman tradition. But notice that Paul is encouraging the women to learn, which would have been countercultural. In fact, women were not educated in the Greco-Roman world. I could talk some more about that, but in the interest of time, I'm going to move on. So scholars such as Bruce Winter and others make the point that there was in the first century this women's lib type movement that developed called the New Roman Woman, in which there was a desire to take active roles by women in public life, including speaking up in the presence of men or their husbands and offering opinions, teaching, and philosophizing. And it's believed by some that this movement may have, as with other cultural things that came into the Corinthian church because of the cosmopolitan nature of the city, come into the church and was causing disruption. And so a big part of what was happening was that you'd have women who would be conducting themselves in ways that were culturally disruptive. So Leon Morris, in his commentary on this passage, says, for women to be asking questions of men in public would have been to discredit Christianity in the eyes of most people. Indeed, among the Greeks, women were discouraged from saying anything in public. Plutarch says that the virtuous woman ought to be modest and guarded about saying anything to hear of outsiders. Again, a woman ought to do her talking either to her husband or through her husband. So this is a context that we are dealing with. A virtuous and honorable woman in that society would not be speaking to men in public. And so Paul is concerned to ensure the conduct of the Corinthian woman does not imitate the New Roman woman and bring negative attention to the fledgling church as being dishonorable and disruptive of the social order. This is what he's likely referring to when he says that it is shameful. Now, that's the same word, shameful, disgraceful, that I told you to stick a pin in earlier because it's the same concept. What he means is it's culturally, in the eyes of the society, it is something that would bring shame. And this is an honor shame society. He's saying we don't want that. That's going to negatively impact the church. And so he says to them, if they want to inquire about something, they should ask their husbands at home. And when he says it's disgraceful, he's likely referring to the cultural practice for women to remain predominantly private and to restrict their interaction with men in public. And so I think this is a context of this language, which we find very strong and very disturbing to us in our cultural context, to say it's shameful for a woman to speak in church. That offends us. But again, that's kind of like me saying, I'm going to look for Damien Jean-Baptiste. Paul is in a different social context. And so his words have a different sense than we would read them immediately, 2,000 years later. I'm going to try and see if we can drive to the end here. That Greek word silent is siget, that is translated silent is sigeo. It's used 3 times. The first time was in verse 28 when it was saying that the person, the prophets need to, the tongue speakers need to keep silent. It's used secondly in verse 30, where it says, if a revelation is made, let the first prophet be silent. And it's used also in verse 34, where it says that the woman should remain silent. Now, it's explained in the essay on 1 Corinthians 14 in the Bible and Gender. In verse 34, when it refers to women, the verb means to stop continual talk or disruptive speech. The call for silence can refer to literal silence or to be quiet and wait your turn. The instruction follows the theme of the entire chapter to maintain order. Considering the context of the 3 uses of the word, silence in this chapter, the declaration is not for the woman to always be silent in the church, but rather at a certain time and situation. The other references in the passage call for temporary silence, not ongoing absolute silence. The point is that based on how it is used in instances dealing with tongue speakers and prophets, when women are told to be silent, we're not to understand that they're not to speak at all in the church, but they are to cease from disruptive speech. And if their speech is not disruptive, then just like the prophets and just like the tongue speakers, they can speak. In fact, we know they could prophesy and pray. And then Paul concludes by saying, or was it from you that the word of God came, or are you the only ones it has reached? If anyone thinks that he's a prophet or spiritual, he should acknowledge that the things I'm writing to you are a command of the Lord. If anyone does not recognize this, he's not recognized. So my brothers earnestly desire to prophesy and do not forbid speaking in tongues, but all things should be done decently and in order. So this order in the worship service is the context, similar to 1 Corinthians 11. Paul reminds the Corinthians that they're a part of a larger Christian community and they just can't do their own thing. Indeed, they're also under his authority as an apostle. And he makes it clear that he's not saying don't prophesy or speak in tongues, but it is the disorderly practice of this speech is restricted. Although he doesn't mention the women, the same approach would obviously apply. He's not saying that women are not to speak in the service. He's saying they're not to do so in an indecent or disorderly way. And so here are a few takeaways that we can take from our study this evening before we get into our Q&A. Firstly, I think what we can take from the passages we looked at and apply in our context is that women can speak in the church's public worship, including praying and prophesying. And prophesying, I think, means to proclaim God's will. The next thing that we can take away is that the creation order has some effect on male or female relationships in marriage and in the church. And finally, women's speech in the church should not bring the church into disrepute by offending cultural expectations in respect of male and female relationships. I am going to stop sharing my slides.